Just a formal greeting for everyone that is watching this video. Welcome, thank you for joining us. We've had a bit of a hiatus, but this evening we carry on with our study of the book of Revelation. We're glad to have you along with us for the journey. There is a little bit of a break that's happening here in terms of my focus this evening. I want to look at Revelation chapter 4 and the obviously the chapters that follow on from that, but I want to give you an introduction and an orientation to the rest of the book again, because in chapter 4 we're entering the throne room, but we need to look at ideas such as what is prophecy, how does the covenant play into all of this, the presence of God, and what is the perspective of the reader, what is the perspective of John. All of these things are significant in how we begin to unpack the rest of the message from Christ through John to the church. So please allow me to just lay another foundation as we go on from here. The purpose of this lesson is to introduce you to the 4th chapter of Revelation by asking a question prior to any kind of chronological debate, because there is a debate around the first verse or two that is quite significant. But before we even get to issues of time or chronology, I want to ask a more fundamental question for me. And the question is, what literary and theological function does this throne room vision perform at this point in Revelation? So notice what I'm asking is, why have we suddenly shifted from the end of chapter 3 to now this presentation of the throne room? Is it purely a chronological thing? What is the purpose of this within the narrative, within the genre of the book of Revelation? And why has John, the author, recorded it for us in this way? So tonight's lesson is not going to try and settle the chronology of Revelation chapters 4 to 22. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to examine firstly how our interpretative system, our method for interpreting, can influence the way that we actually read Revelation chapter 4. Secondly, I want to just address what biblical prophecy is intended to accomplish, what prophecy actually is. And then as this develops later on, we can start to look at how it is that the book of Revelation combines prophetic, apocalyptic, epistolary, and covenantal features within its narrative. So the thing that we also need to address, perhaps not tonight, but at some point as we look through chapter 4, is why is it that the reader must see the throne now before he sees the judgments? And that goes back to my foundational question of what is the purpose of this vision in the narrative at this point? And I think it's a significant question. So my central thesis for this evening would basically be as follows: that Revelation chapter 4 introduces a new visionary scene, but it does not necessarily introduce an entirely new historical period. The chapter first orients John, the viewer of the vision, right, and through John, us as readers, as the church, to the present heavenly reality of God's throne. That is my core thesis that I'm going to be developing over the next couple of weeks and showing you why I believe that this is a good reading of what's happening here in the book of Revelation. And the other part that goes with this is that the book of Revelation unveils divine presence, authority, and worship in chapters 4 and 5. And it's from there that everything that follows should be interpreted. So a secondary proposal that I'm also going to be looking at as we carry on with our study is that John's ascent up into the throne room, this throne vision that he has, deliberately echoes Moses' ascent at Sinai when he went up the mountain to meet with God. If you can recall that theophany of smoke and fire. So it's not an exact one-to-one match. There is a transformation and an escalation of the pattern through the realities of the new covenant and of Jesus Christ. But basically, both these stories show us something about access to God's presence. And what Revelation does is it escalates it by showing us how we access God's presence in Christ Jesus, since he is our true high priest. So we will be looking at that eventually as well. My governing principle in terms of method here, for those of you who want to understand how I'm approaching it, as I said right at the start, is to look at this from a literary and a theological perspective. So my basic principle here is that the literary and theological function of the book of Revelation should be examined before we start to try and reconstruct the chronology of the events. And the reason why I'm saying this is not because I think that chronology is unimportant or insignificant to the text or to our understanding of the prophecy of the book. But what I am suggesting is that we should first be asking ourselves why John places this vision here and other visions in the order that he does before we try to determine where everything is supposed to fit together. So the questions that I'm not attempting to settle, at least not for tonight and maybe not for another week or two, is, does Revelation 4 occur after the rapture? We're not going to be looking at that yet tonight. Do the seals of Revelation chapter 6, the opening of the seals and the judgments that come with it, do they refer exclusively to some kind of future tribulational event or not? Do the seals portray the whole church age? Is the book primarily futurist, preterist, idealist, or eclectic? I'm not even going to be addressing that yet at this stage, nor am I going to be answering whether we believe that Revelation should be read in strict chronological order, or rather that it recapitulates the same period through successive cycles as the narrative unfolds. Now, there I may have lost a few of you already with something that sounds like a very fancy word, this word recapitulation. But all that it basically means is it is this idea that Revelation doesn't simply tell one long story from beginning to end, but rather that it may describe a general period of history several times, with each new vision looking at that period from a slightly different perspective or with a different emphasis. So think of it as though you were watching a sporting event of some kind, and there are several camera angles that you can watch the sports game from. Each camera is showing you exactly the same match, but each different camera will reveal something that the other cameras can't. And this is probably not the best way, but it's the best way that I could imagine to try and explain recapitulation to us. So even tonight, I'll address some of it, but I'm not going to try and say that we must read it this way or we must read it strictly chronologically or whatever. Those are not the main goals of where we're going with this, okay? Because if we look at Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, and let me just read it quickly there. It is open on your screens. You should be able to see it there, top left. John writes the following. He says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I had heard, like the sound of a trumpet, speaking with me, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things.'" And I think perhaps I should already highlight that term, "after these things," because that will highlight for you why there's been so much discussion around how chapter 4 verse 1 fits in with the conclusion of chapter 3. So the questions that I've asked or that I've mentioned here about recapitulation, about preterism, futurism, the chronology, all of those things, they do matter. But chapter 4 verse 1 in itself can't settle those issues for us. So the narrower question that I want to look at tonight is, what is John being shown next, subsequently? And why is he shown it here? I've mentioned this before, but let me just repeat it because it bears repeating and I think it's significant. What is it that John is being shown next? And why is he being shown it here? That to me is the foundational question that I want to address as I start reading through these things and trying to piece together what the Holy Spirit is conveying to us through John the prophet. So the first part of what I want to look at is I want to begin with Walford's futurist reading of the book of Revelation. And he says here, he talks about the invitation from heaven. This is his opening to his discussion of the book. And he starts there beginning with chapter 4. The third major section of the book of Revelation is introduced following the divinely inspired outline of 119. And then he continues. Now, the reason why I'm beginning with this, this is why I broke from reading the text quickly, just to explain that the reason why I'm beginning with this is not because I want to attack his interpretation, not at all. What I want to do is I want to read through it to show you or to illustrate to you how hermeneutical inference works. In other words, it will become clear as we look at his argument and the points that he raises, it'll become clear how he got to that conclusion and what his thinking was about the rest of the book and the rest of the Bible to get him to the place where he interprets the book of Revelation in this way. So you'll see here, I'll read through it now, but let me just summarize before we even get there. Walford is basically arguing that Revelation chapter 1 concerns the things which John saw. And then Revelation chapters 2 and 3, which we've been dealing with in quite a bit of detail for the last few weeks, they concern the things which are in relation to John and the churches he was addressing. And then Revelation chapter 4 onward concerns those things that are to come. So the events of Revelation chapter 4 to 22 concern the consummation, the ending, the end goal, if you will, of the age. Their futurity is supported by his perceived, or at least what he reads as the perceived absence of historical fulfillment. So in other words, you'll see here that he's going to be arguing that because the things that are revealed in the book of Revelation don't correlate to historical events yet, therefore they must be future, not just to John and the church at that stage, but to us as well. So with that in mind, let me read to you what he says here. He says, this section is in contrast to what John saw in chapter 1. His vision of the glorified Christ described in the clause, the things which thou hast seen. And in contrast to the revelation of chapter 2 and 3, messages to the 7 churches designated as the things which are, beginning in chapter 4, things to come are unfolded which have to do with the consummation or the end of the age. So, he points there that the concept that the book of Revelation, beginning with chapter 4, verse 1, is future from the standpoint of the 20th century is a broad conclusion growing out of the lack of correspondence of these prophecies to anything that has been fulfilled before. So a normal interpretation of this section, which understands these prophecies as literal events, would require that they be viewed as future. The futuristic concept is supported by the similarity of the expression in chapter 1, verse 19, the things which shall be hereafter. And then he just explains the Greek clause there, and he puts it to the clause he relates it to the clause in 4, verse 1, things which must be hereafter. So, and I've highlighted this, the bits that I've highlighted in red here, I've highlighted for myself because the author is making a strong case for things that I, as a fellow academic and one who may read the book of Revelation slightly differently from him, these are things that I need to take into consideration and need to be aware of. But note the points that he raises here, carrying on from his text. Chapter 4 and 5 are the introduction and background of the tremendous sweep of prophetic events predicted in the rest of the book. If chapter 4 and succeeding chapters relate to the future, they provide an important clue concerning the interpretation of the vision and the prophetic events which unfold in those chapters. One of the principal reasons for confusion of the study of the book of Revelation, according to him, has been the failure to grasp this point. And here is a very good argument that he makes. He says, if Revelation has no chronological structure and is merely a symbolic presentation of moral truth. So in other words, he is addressing this idea of recapitulation here. He's addressing this idea that if you want to interpret the book of Revelation as some general symbolic narrative of the battle between good and evil played out over successive events, and that is the only weight that you attach to it, you have a problem. So that's kind of what he's trying to argue. So let me just read through it again. He says, if Revelation has no chronological structure and is merely a symbolic presentation of moral truth, its prophetic significance is reduced to a minimum. And I want you to remember this phrase that he says here, its prophetic significance, because the weight of his argument is connected to what he understands the function of biblical prophecy to be. And that is something that I am going to be addressing this evening. So just keep that in mind. And then he says there, carrying on from what I've highlighted in green, if, as others hold, the predictions of this section of Revelation are already fulfilled in the early persecution of the church, now he's addressing the preterist presumption that these things have already happened, that they either happened in AD 70 at the destruction of the Herodian temple, or at some later point. Some people would say that, late 4th century AD might have been the culmination of these events. I don't want to go into detail about that, but he's addressing that interpretative framework. And he says, if, as others hold, the predictions of this section of Revelation are already fulfilled in the early persecution of the church, it also robs the book of any prophecy of the future. Okay, and then I'm not going to read what he says there in parenthesis, but note here, he says, a literal interpretation of the prophecies beginning in chapter 4 is not fulfilled in any historic event, not precisely, and must therefore be regarded from a futurist viewpoint if it is indeed valid prophecy. And this is the point that I was trying to explain earlier, that he is arguing that because we cannot correlate the prophecy to an actual historic fulfillment in the last 2,000 years, therefore what the book of Revelation is describing must still be future. That is his argument with all of that. So what I want to do, I want to quickly show you guys a diagram. Revelation chapter 1 looks at the things which John saw, right? An introduction to the revelation of Jesus Christ. We've dealt with all of that many months in the past. Then it moves on to chapters 2 and 3, those things that are. So we've gone from past tense to present tense, right? The message to the 7 churches in Asia and the present church age. Okay, so note what he's done here. He is taking the things that are, chapter 2 and 3, not just as those 7 historical churches, but also as significant to the whole of the church age for the last 2,000 years. And then step 3, he infers that from Revelation chapter 4 onward, we are dealing with the things to come. In other words, John is taken up into heaven and he sees visions of future events. And all of this culminates, stage 4 here on your screen, in Revelation chapter 4 verse 22, where it concerns the consummation of the age, the eschaton, the end of all things. There is the great tribulation, the judgments, the victory of Christ over the powers of the world, and the new heaven and the new earth that are formed. Now, it's a beautiful presentation here. I like that it's simple and it's clean, and it assumes a linear chronology here. So his interpretation, if you think about what he's saying here, and I'm obviously adding stuff that he didn't just expose in the few sentences that we read, but his interpretation is internally coherent. Right? If chapters 6 to 19 of Revelation, in other words, the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments that are still to come, if they describe a concentrated period of unprecedented global judgment, which some would call the Great Tribulation, right? Then he sees these as events that have not yet occurred. And then by that logic, do you see how he gets to this? If that is your assumption, then it is logical that Revelation chapter 4 naturally becomes the transition into this future period. So my purpose is not to dismiss his reasoning. What I want to identify is the direction of his reasoning, because Walvoord's reasoning goes in two directions. Right? It goes from Revelation 1:19 and 4 verse 1. He reads, the things which you have seen, the things which are, and those things which will take place. So again, as you see on the screen there, it's the past, the present, the future. He sees that as a threefold canonical structure that reveals how the book should be read. That's his first direction. His second one is that he's reading from this later portion, from chapter 6 to 19, he's reading backwards into Revelation chapter 4. He concludes that because these judgments have no adequate correspondence in past history and must therefore be future, that conclusion is being read back into Revelation chapter 4 verse 1, so that when he reads the things that must happen after this, naturally from that vantage point, those must be future events, not just to John, not just to the church, but even to us. There are still future things that need to happen. So what I would like you to recognize in this, again, this is not an attack, I'm analyzing a hermeneutic method here, is that Walvoord's futurism has not arisen from the words of Revelation 4 verse 1 alone. It arises from his interpretation of the entire sequence of everything that follows. And that's not illegitimate. It's not wrong to do that. All interpreters, myself included, will read individual passages in relation to their understanding of the book as a whole. But the process needs to be made visible, and that's what I wanted to illustrate to you this evening. So my question to you that I want you to ponder as we deal with this is the following. Is Revelation chapter 4 verse 1 in itself sufficient to prove that John has moved beyond the present church age and into a prelude to future tribulation? Okay. The appropriate initial answer to this question should be no. It may support that conclusion, but we cannot establish that interpretation or that truth, if it is a truth, solely on that one proof text. So we can't establish it without additional arguments concerning the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, Israel, the church, and the overall structure of the whole book of Revelation. Now, what I want you to see as well is that most careful scholars that are pre-tribulational and futurist, like Walvoord, they don't argue that Revelation 4 verse 1 in itself proves a pre-tribulation rapture. That's not what he says here. It's not what he's aiming at. But he does fit Revelation chapter 4 verse 1 into his understanding of the pre-tribulation rapture. So note that Walvoord's argument throughout all of this is cumulative. And again, I know that this might feel like a distraction, but I'm building upon this because it's important for us to have a good foundation in how to interpret and how others interpret, so that we can begin to evaluate, but am I actually understanding this correctly? Right? Where are my presumptions? Where am I coming from? So again, to go back to Walvoord, his argument is cumulative, as I said. It starts with Revelation chapter 1 verse 19, providing the threefold outline. Let me actually go back to Revelation chapter 1 verse 19, and you'll see why this is such a foundational text for most interpreters that have a futurist leaning towards the book of Revelation. Because it says here that John is instructed, therefore write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. So according to that commission, let me even underline that in green for us, according to that commission, Walford is now interpreting the chronological framework of the entire book. So this verse is providing the outline. The next part of his argument is that the 7 churches represent the church age, not just 7 literal churches, but the entire church age. And then his argument develops as follows. Because the church is absent from the earth after chapter 3. Now, this is based on a reading, an assumption that the church can't be present because the word ecclesia, the word for church in Greek, is not used in the book of Revelation after the end of chapter 3. Right? We only hear talk about seals and trumpets and Israel and nations, but never the church anymore. So building on top of his prior interpretations, he now adds this by saying that because the church is absent from the church after chapter 3, and because John is called up into heaven, right, that could represent the pre-tribulation rapture of the church and of the saints, that John's ascent symbolically represents the ascent of the church. Now, he's not alone in this. This is a well-developed systematic theology within camps that like this interpretation of the book of Revelation. I'm just explaining to you the logic of how they get to what they're interpreting. So John is called up to heaven, and the 24 elders represent the glorified church in heaven. That's the next step of this cumulative argument. And then his interpretation goes further, again based on a systematic theology that is quite common. It's not just him. He just develops the argument quite well, that chapters 6 to 19, which represent the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments, and then the final judgment when Christ comes with his army riding the white horse to defeat the beast and the nations that have gathered in Har Megiddo, in the valley of Megiddo. So those chapters from 6 to 19 are then interpreted to describe what we call the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy. Now, I can't go into great detail here this evening, but if you want to read the book of Daniel, you'll see that he is given a timeline for things that will happen in the nation of Israel chronologically, and they interpret the futurist and the pre-tribulational futurist interpretation is that what is described by Daniel as the 70th week, or in the book of Daniel to Daniel as the 70th week, is now being unpacked in the book of Revelation in these chapters. And therefore, because of all of this, Revelation chapter 4 marks the transition into the post-church period. That's how he gets to this conclusion that we've moved from the church age in chapter 3, and starting with chapter 4 verse 1, we're basically shifting into the future age. So note here again, what I'm saying is that Revelation chapter 4 verse 1 is not functioning as an independent text. It's not a proof text of this theological position. The significance of this verse is determined by the broader reading of the book of Revelation. So it is a reading that has already reached conclusions, as I said, about the nature of the church, of Israel, of Daniel's 70th week, and the chronology of the book as a whole. And those conclusions are now read back into chapter 4, verse 1. So the second thing that I need to raise here, and because I believe that it is something that should be raised because it's a valid argument, is Walford's objection to recapitulation. Remember this idea that it is cyclical, that we're just seeing the same thing, perhaps from different perspectives, but the same historical events described again. So According to a classical recapitulationist reading, Revelation repeatedly returns to the same broad period of history. Let's call it the church age. And each major visionary cycle describes that period again before it ends with the final judgment and God's ultimate victory. So let me show you a diagram again. If we look at this one here, the best I could come up with as an example for you of the classic recapitulation period. You'll see here that on the left you have the seal judgments, then the second movement being the trumpet judgments, the third movement being the bowl judgments. And what recapitulation does is it rightly sees similarities between these sections of the book, right? It assumes that they're all dealing with the same present age, but that the seal judgments and the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgment ultimately all end in a similar fashion. They all end with a climactic judgment of thunder, of voices, of lightning, earthquakes, right? And I've given you the scriptures there. Hopefully they're correct. Revelation chapter 8, verse 5, Revelation chapter 11, 19, and Revelation chapter 16, 18 to 21. You'll see that there's a repetition of the same sort of mini culmination at the end of each of these cycles. So the pattern is basically, as you can see here on the right, that the present age between Christ's first and second comings, right, has a series of judgments, whether that be the seals, the trumpets, or the bowls, that all end in a climactic conclusion with this thunder, lightning, etc., and that ends the cycle, or what appears to be the end, with the parousia of Jesus Christ, the appearance of Christ, the second coming, and then moving into chapters 21 to 22, where we describe the new creation and the new heaven and the new earth eventually. So that is the outline of what the recapitulationist reading would be. Now you can see that that's very different from the strictly linear chronological interpretation that the futurist reading of Wolfert has, for example. So notice, if you look at this pattern that I have on the screen, notice what the diagram is not saying, right? It's not explaining why John repeats himself, right? If we assume that these are repetitions here between seals, trumpets, bowls, recapitulation isn't really explaining to us why John repeats himself. Although it does observe that he does, it hasn't necessarily yet answered the question of why. Now, it also doesn't explain whether later cycles add new information or not, or whether there's a theological development across these cycles, or whether history is moving towards a goal other than these climactic conclusions that you see in each cycle. All it's doing is it's illustrating the structural claims that you see on the screen there. So this is why Wolfert was warning, if I understand him correctly, that if Revelation has no chronological structure in the linear sense that he has understood it, then it's merely a symbolic representation of moral truth, and its prophetic significance is significantly diminished. So I think that his objection here is something that is deserving of a proper response. So again, bear with me, but I want to address this because I think it is something that we need to address as we consider how we're going to read the book of Revelation. What I believe Wolfert is correct to protect, he is insisting that Revelation is a genuinely prophetic book, and we must read it as prophecy, not just symbolism. And I think that it's right to protect that instinct, because the book of Revelation is not merely some timeless religious symbolism. It's not just an inspirational allegory or a collection of moral lessons. It's not just a poetic description of some grand conflict between good and evil. John explicitly calls the book of Revelation prophecy, right? And the book itself announces realities that must take place, right? It presents divine judgments that are moving towards a consummation, and it anticipates the final inevitable victory of God and the Lamb. So any kind of reading that dissolves the book of Revelation into some general moral truth would fail to account for its historical and its eschatological claims. And I think that that is significant. And I agree with Walford that that is something that should be protected, that we don't neglect the fact that the book is prophecy. But what he does in his argument, perhaps without realizing it, is he has created a false binary, right? And the false binary is as follows, if I can explain it this way, that we have framed two options, that you either have a strict chronological prediction or you have symbolism and truth, as though these two are mutually exclusive or that they are alternatives. But they're not just alternatives, right? They both can work together. The recapitulationist framework that you see there on your screen, it doesn't necessarily deny actual history or future events or divine judgment, the historic fulfillment of these things, or even the return of Christ. It doesn't neglect any of these. It doesn't deny chronology in total. What it does argue is that the chronology is within these visionary cycles, and that later cycles revisit the same historical period, right? That's kind of the argument that recapitulation is laying forward. So what I would add, and this is how I am reading it at present and how my thinking is developing as I study the book of Revelation, is not just that we have a chronology within these cycles, but I believe that these successive cycles, from seal to trumpet to bowl, what they're doing is they're actually intensifying the events. They're expanding on prior events, and sometimes they are reinterpreting earlier visions. So what's happening is that each cycle moves towards consummation, but it is progressively clarified throughout the book. So I'm calling this telic recapitulation, just so that you know. I had to think of some kind of a term. This is not an academic consensus. This is the best term that I could think of to explain it. Telic, from the Greek telos, meaning that there is an end goal, that it is progressing towards something. So I see recapitulation, I see repetition, but it's not just repetition without a point. There is a movement within the book, despite areas of repetition, towards an ultimate conclusion. So in other words, and I'm going to read this very carefully from my notes here, the visions revisit related historical and theological realities. Note, I haven't said just chronological. I've said the visions revisit related historical and theological realities, but they do so with movement, with intensification and direction towards an appointed telos, towards an appointed end goal. So the visions aren't just rotating in place. Instead, they're moving towards a consummation. So let me open this one for you on the screen. Now, this is a lot more complex, but this is the best that ChatGPT could do with what I was feeding it to try and draw this together as a diagram for you. But this basically highlights how I am beginning to understand the literary progression of the book of Revelation. I'm offering this to you as a framework for discussion. I'm not saying this is established consensus. This is the beginning point of our discussion of trying to understand how the book of Revelation works. So you can see there that I am still reading it within a chronological pattern. I am just inferring that within this chronology, there is repetition and escalation of events as we progress. So rather than saying, no, we're just seeing the same thing 3 times, what I'm saying is we are seeing a repetition of events that is becoming more intense. So the pattern of judgment is the same, but the exact judgment is not the same as it unfolds across history. So that should give you an overview of what I'm trying to argue for as we read through the book of Revelation. And as we go on this journey and as we discuss it, if I feel that, look, this is not adequate to explain what is going on, then grant me the grace to say, okay, let's revisit this, let's change this, because that is the point of interpretation. It's not to say this is what I want the book of Revelation to say. This is saying this is the best interpretation I have at the moment. But if a better solution presents itself and I realize that maybe I have made a mistake in my interpretation, then I need to be open to that and say, yes, let's look at the book of Revelation differently. Right. So on that point, the last thing that I want to look at this evening, part 3 of this whole long discussion that we've had, is the question of what exactly is biblical prophecy. And the reason I'm doing this is because Volford, who I addressed at the beginning here, is concerned about protecting the prophetic weight and significance of the book of Revelation. And again, I think that's entirely admirable. I've justified him on that point. The question, though, is what precisely is biblical prophecy? And this is where we need to look at. Because, yes, biblical prophecy genuinely does foretell future events. Examples throughout canon would include the prophets who foretold the Assyrian invasion, the Babylonian exile, the fall of Babylon, the restoration of Israel from their exile, the role of Cyrus in all of this, the coming of the Davidic ruler, the suffering and vindication of the servant, who we now know was Jesus Christ, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the day of Pentecost, and it predicts the day of the Lord and the resurrection and the new creation. These are predictive events. Don't lose sight of that. Prediction is not something that we should be embarrassed about or try to explain away, as some secular academics have tried to do. Prophecy, or prediction, I should say, is intrinsic to biblical prophecy. But where we need to be careful, let's not exhaust the significance of prophecy by saying it is only predictive. And this is where I differ a little bit from Volford's conclusion. And let me explain to you why. Because any prophetic book, if you read through the Old Testament literature, any prophetic book does more than just tell its hearers, its listeners, what will happen next. The prophets in their recorded writings also do a number of things. The first of which is to interpret present events from God's perspective. If we look here in the central panel, if we go to Isaiah chapter 7, because I suppose, need to read verse 1 for you. What this whole passage is about is that Ahaz sees the Syro-Ephraimite coalition before him as a political crisis. Now, Isaiah the prophet reveals that the real issue is not the political crisis that confronts him, but rather whether Judah will trust their God, Yahweh. The prophet is not only predicting the future, he is interpreting the present as well. So let's just consider, and I know this might seem like a bit of a dull exercise, but let's just consider the very first verse here, right? When Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and Pekah of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. Okay. Notice what the prophet has done first, or at least whoever edited his prophecies together into this book, if it wasn't Isaiah himself. Notice what has been done here. This prophetic passage, like some sections of the book, it doesn't immediately begin by predicting the future. He's first describing an historical situation. The prophecy is rooted in an actual historical situation. And only once that is done does Isaiah begin to interpret the situation from God's perspective. And you can read through the rest of that passage yourself when you have time to see how that unfolds. So the issue is no longer, will Judah survive this invasion? The deeper question, as I hinted at earlier, is, will Judah trust in their Lord or trust in the nations? And it's after framing that which the prediction follows. But the prediction itself is not the whole of this prophetic literature. So what I'm trying to say is that the prophecy first explains theological significance of the present time of those hearers before it reveals what God will do in the future. So as a teaching principle, I guess what I'm trying to say is that a prophetic book is not composed entirely of predictive statements, right? It can contain historical narrative. It can contain covenant interpretation, theological evaluation, calls to repentance, announcements of judgment, promises of restoration to the covenant people, and the genuine prediction of future events. Note that last one is a part of prophecy, but it forms a part of the entire prophetic message. So how do we apply this to the book of Revelation? Well, for me, this observation raises an important hermeneutical question. If Isaiah, a prophetic book, and we just looked at one passage there, is not predictive in every sentence, right? Should we expect Revelation to function differently? Or should we begin to read Revelation with the same literary sensitivity? Perhaps these last chapters, this concluding section from chapter 4 to 22 of the book of Revelation, perhaps it also contains descriptions of present realities, heavenly interpretations of earthly events, covenantal exhortations, warnings, worship, symbolic visions, and predictions of future events, all woven together in one long passage of prophecy. Now, I know that this sounds a bit silly because somebody could come up to me and say, well, of course, Isaiah isn't predictive in every sense, right? I mean, that's kind of obvious. Moreover, Revelation chapter 6 to 19 and on aren't exactly like Isaiah chapter 7, because the book of Revelation is almost entirely visions. So why are you comparing the two together? My point here is not as simple as just saying, well, not every sentence is predictive. I need to build on this. For the sake of, how shall we say, evaluating Walford's defense of the prophetic nature of the weight of the book of Revelation, right? My real point is the following, and I'm going to read this again from my notes so that hopefully it comes across clearly, that even when a prophet predicts the future, the prediction serves a broader prophetic purpose. Right? It's not just about the prediction, it's about the purpose of the prediction. And that is what I've been trying to highlight with the Isaiah example. And if we follow this logic, then this is where the book of Revelation becomes really interesting. Because let's suppose that the seals in Revelation chapter 6 really are future, for the sake of argument. Like I said, I don't want to debate issues of chronology just yet, but for the sake of argument, let's say that the opening of the scroll and the breaking of the seals and the judgments that follow, let's assume that those are future for the sake of this argument. The question is still, why is John showing us this? I'm not just asking what happens, right? I'm not asking just about the prediction. I'm asking, what is the church? What are we supposed to understand by John communicating this to us? And that is a question about the purpose of the prophecy. So instead of concluding, well, a prophetic book is not just predictive statements, as we've seen in the Isaiah example, I should be saying, perhaps if I try to refine my point here, that biblical prophecy is never just about prediction. And notice the difference there. Even the predictions of the book of Revelation have a pastoral, a theological, and a covenantal purpose. We saw that when we read chapters 2 and 3 and looked at the application of the message to the churches, to our present relationship with Christ and with God. Now, the same thing carries on throughout the book of Revelation. All of its predictions have a pastoral, a theological, and a covenantal purpose. So with that in mind, as I finish off this evening, let's just look at the other functions of prophecy, the genre of prophecy within the Bible. I've already elaborated on the first one, that prophecy interprets present events from God's perspective. And I gave you Isaiah chapter 7 there in the middle as an example. Now, let me just mention a few others so that you can see broadly what the genre of prophecy does. It also prosecutes covenantal unfaithfulness. And a good example here is Hosea chapter 4 verses 1 to 3, where the prophet says to him, he says, "The Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land." And this is almost courtroom language. Israel has violated the covenant. The prophet is functioning as God's covenant prosecutor. Let's just go there quickly. Let me show you the passage so you can see it on the screen. "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites," says Hosea, "because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land." And then the accusations come for the rest of that verse and into verses 2 and 3. So like I said, it's courtroom language. Israel violated the covenant, and the prophet now serves as God's messenger and prosecutor for the covenant suzerain. So another function that the prophetic genre entails is that of exposing idolatry and injustice. Let me give you an example here from the book of Amos. If we just go to Amos chapter 5, look at verse 21. He says, this is God speaking through the prophet to the nation of Israel. He says, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring me choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. So you see how injustice is exposed here by the prophet. And I'm sure you can think of many other examples where their idolatry was exposed as well. So a fourth aspect of the genre of prophecy and what it can do is it can reveal the theological meaning of political events. We saw something similar in Isaiah chapter 7. If you go to Jeremiah chapter 27, and I don't have time to read through this entire long passage, but the broad summary is that the prophet is signifying to the nation, or at least he's telling the nation of Israel, that Nebuchadnezzar, this king that has come to oppress them, isn't merely the king of Babylon, that he is in effect God's servant, accomplishing divine judgment. And the prophet explains why these political events have happened to the nation of Israel, what the meaning of it is, what the purpose of it is. He explains to them that it is because of their hardness of heart, how they have rebelled, how they treated slaves and foreigners, and of course this on top of this, the intergenerational sin that had been going on throughout the nation of Israel. So another example would be Ezekiel chapter 7. Here, if you just look at what the prophet says, he says there, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says to the land of Israel. The end has come upon the four corners of the land." Now, I'm not going to read the rest of it, but in your own time, please just read a couple of verses down, and you'll see that the prophet here is repeatedly announcing that the end has come. This is predictive, yes, but it is also covenantal. because judgment arrives because the covenant has been broken. So this is another function. It is warning of judgment. It's not just saying, oh, well, these things are going to happen. No, there's a purpose behind why God is telling them these things are going to happen. So that brings us to a seventh aspect of what prophecy accomplishes, and that is that it can sustain hope for the people who hear the message. And this is particularly significant, as you'll see, as we continue through the book of Revelation. But let's just look very quickly at Isaiah chapter 40 here as an example. 40, where am I going? Yep, right at the beginning of the passage. No, you can see there from the outset. What does the prophet say? He says, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for." So immediately after the judgment, there comes hope. And the prophet reminds the nation of Israel that God has not abandoned his covenant purposes. An eighth aspect of prophecy as a genre is that it discloses God's purposes in history. And a very good example of this would be a lot of the book of Daniel, but especially Daniel chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that Daniel comes to interpret. Now again, I'm not going to read through the whole long passage, but Nebuchadnezzar sees successive kingdoms emerging in his region. And Daniel explains to the king that this is God's sovereign purpose throughout history. So this is prophecy perhaps on the grandest scale, because he's looking at future events, but he's not just saying this is going to happen. He's saying this is God's purpose in history. This is how he's going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish in humanity through history. And then the last, well, probably not the last, but the last thing that I could think of or identify is that the prophetic genre also summons us to faithful endurance. So let's have a look here at Habakkuk chapter 2, and I'm going to read here from verse 2. Okay, then the Lord replied, "Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness," or by faith. Now, here, I'm going to highlight that little passage there, because Habakkuk is not simply predicting Babylon and those events. He is calling God's people to remain faithful while they are in exile, while they are being oppressed. He is calling them to faithful endurance. And this one to me is particularly significant because the entire book of Revelation is filled with these exhortations to remain faithful, to endure in the faith. We saw how many times that happened in chapters 2 and 3 when Jesus was addressing each church in turn. And now we'll see globally that exhortation remains, that God keeps saying to his people, endure, 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 as these events in the book of Revelation unfold. So it's interesting that the New Testament keeps going back to this verse that I highlighted there in green for you out of Habakkuk. So the point of what I just elucidated for us quickly here is that, again, biblical prophecy is predictive, but it's not just predictive. Its function is not limited to just prediction. It's not just about foresight, right? In biblical prophecy, prediction is the means, or one of the means, by which God interprets reality for us and shows us how we should understand reality. It exposes covenant infidelity, as we've already seen in previous chapters, and prophecy is the means by which God summons his people to a faithful response. And I think that is significant because the book of Revelation, as we'll see, we've already seen it, but we'll see it as we progress through the book. It does all of these things, It predicts, it warns, it comforts, it prosecutes covenant unfaithfulness, it interprets world events, it reveals heaven's perspective to us about our earthly history, and it calls the churches to endure. Therefore, to reduce the book of Revelation to a timetable of future events is to diminish the richness of biblical prophecy itself. And that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to say, well, that the book of Revelation must be future because it must be predictive. I'm not saying it isn't future. Like I said, we'll get to all of that. But to argue that it can only be future because it must predict is to minimize the function or the purpose of the prophetic genre. And the book of Revelation is so much more than that. If the book of Revelation was just to tell us what's going to happen, it would not have endured. It would not have made it into canon. The point is that God is explaining things to us. He is teaching things to us, and he is orienting us in relationship to him through what is unveiled in the book of Revelation, while also telling us what has happened, is happening, and what will happen. And I think that it's just important that we remember that framework. So next week I'm going to carry on with the book of Revelation chapter 4, and we'll start to unpack the literary structure and the events of this chapter as we go through. I just wanted to lay a foundation tonight so that you can understand what I believe to be the best approach to a book that is prophetic and apocalyptic, and that we understand it for its full meaning as opposed to just seeing it as some kind of predictive text that will help us to unravel events that we read in the newspaper. I think if we do that, we've missed a significant portion of what the book of Revelation actually means.